Now, here's Ed Bernstein.
Well, today we're going to explore two very interesting books, and with me to talk about them is Dr. Tom Wright, and a little bit later in the show, Bill Friedman. Now, Bill wrote a book about the mob. Your book, Dr. Wright, Impunity, Human Rights and Democracy, is really about Chile and Argentina, but some would consider the mob having been in those countries in the 70s and 80s.
Well, a form of mob, I think you could call it that, yes.
Yeah.
Those countries experienced what I would consider to be state terrorism during the 70s and 80s. In Chile, under the dictatorship of General Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, and in Argentina, a shorter period of nearly 8 years of what they call the Dirty War, where the military dictatorship disappeared up to 30,000 people. These are both regimes of state terrorism. They weren't the only ones in Latin America, but they were the most sophisticated and among the more deadly ones.
When we look at the Middle East today and talk about terrorism going on and dictatorships in the Middle East, you know, it's nothing new compared to what was going on in South America in those years.
No, it's not at all. Terrorism in the United States, we tend to think of it, and this is more common, we tend to think of groups of radicalized people attacking governments and apparatuses of the state in order to bring about change. We don't think so much about terrorism by the state, and that frankly is much more difficult to defend yourself against.
Right.
When the whole apparatus of the state, the military, the police, the government itself are using tactics of terrorism as a means of staying in power and rooting out their enemies, people they consider enemies of the state.
And the gist of this was political in essence. Pinochet was a dictator, a military man who had the support of the American government at that time, correct?
Oh, he did. The United States was put on the defensive by the Cuban Revolution, so we have to look back a few years. Once Castro came to power, he pushed for a revolution throughout the hemisphere, and of course the example of what happened in Cuba was an inspiration to many of Latin America's poor and marginalized people. And so you had revolutionary movements spring up in virtually every country. And this is in the heart of the Cold War. The United States, of course, has to be opposed to that. Mm-hmm. And U.S. governments, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, tended to support dictatorships that would come down hard on the left in their countries.
On the socialists, on the communists.
Yes, and people who weren't either of those, but who appeared to be maybe subversive.
Right, so different than Castro, who was really pro-socialist, pro-communist. Pinochet was on the other side of that coin.
Oh, yes,
right?
he was. He certainly was. And he cracked down very hard on Chile's Communist Party, its Socialist Party, and other leftists who were organized in different units. And as you say, he had the full support of the U.S. government under Nixon and Henry Kissinger.
So when you write about, you know, the human rights, the impunity and democracy, the United States really did not intervene, as you said. They were more supportive of some of this. So there was a lot of murders, a lot of kidnappings, a lot of torturing, a lot of imprisonment. The United States just, you know, stood by and watched it all happen, huh?
Well, that's true, except during Jimmy Carter's time, and Carter, of course, made human rights, as we all know, human rights a centerpiece of his foreign policy. He didn't want to deal with countries, give aid to countries, have good relations with countries that routinely violated human rights. So he backed off from that support. In fact, he brought about change in both Chile and Argentina by taking a harder line against these dictatorships. But yeah, the United States government was well aware of what was going on, and in fact, in recognizing the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, Nixon and Kissinger gave a green light, in my opinion, to the rest of the Latin American countries to go ahead and do anything at all to quash the left. In other words, open the door for U.S. approval of repressive regimes, including those that use state terrorism.
Was this a mistake that we made at that time?
It was a mistake, in my opinion, but also I understand the U.S. position. The Cold War was real. and the U.S. interests were threatened. And in Chile, for example, Salvador Allende was elected president in 1970. He was a socialist, and his platform was to move Chile towards socialism. That, of course, meant that he would be nationalizing a lot of U.S. economic interests in the country, and he did in the 3 years before he was overthrown by Pinochet.
And did we have a lot of financial interest in Chile at that time?
We did.
Argentina?
Yes, in both countries. But in Chile, U.S. interests owned the major export of Chile, copper. They only owned half of it by the time Allende came to power, because his predecessor, Eduardo Frei, nationalized half of those holdings. But Allende carried up. But U.S. interests were in all fields: banking, telecommunications, transportation, all fields really, manufacturing. And so, yes, there was a definite stake that the U.S. had there.
Now, some people would ask, why is it important to read a book about Chile and Argentina 40 years ago during these very troubled times? This is a very well-researched book. It's not. It's totally non. It's totally true. It's statistically. It's not the kind of reading that we're going to sit down and enjoy like James Patterson book.
Well, it's not light reading.
Yeah.
I agree with you there, and it was not all that easy to write, frankly. But here's what I take from this. In the end, this is uplifting. Why? Because in these two countries, unlike anywhere else in the world, all the people involved in state terrorism, the practitioners of state terrorism, the former repressors, all of them have lost their impunity. And by now, hundreds have been tried in their own domestic courts by their fellow citizens and have been convicted. Hundreds of them in both countries are serving jail sentences, prison sentences. And normally, people who conduct themselves like they did in these two countries, killing, torturing, disappearing people, get away with it. They normally don't face consequences. Think of Pol Pot in Cambodia. He died peacefully in Cambodia. Think of Idi Amin in Uganda. These are names out of the past. In Latin America, Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti. He died and passed the regime on to his son. So the point is, this is an optimistic story out of a really terrible scene in the 70s and 80s while these regimes were in power. People are now being held accountable. And this is unique in these two countries.
Right. And even Pinochet, who I guess was never sent to prison, or maybe was for a short period of time, but he even didn't take responsibility at the end for some of the acts that he committed?
Well, he didn't, actually, take responsibility. He always thought he'd done the right thing. Saving the country from communism is how he put it. Other people would disagree with that. There wasn't any danger of real communism coming in. He, however, was arrested in London on a warrant from a Spanish judge to be extradited to Spain to face charges. Spain had a universal jurisdiction law, meaning that they could take criminals in from any part of the world and try them in their courts.
So if there was a Spanish citizen that was murdered in Peru or Chile, they can try him in Spain?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And he stayed there 504 days, 540 days, a long time. He finally got off because the British courts found he had mental incapacity to help in his own defense. Went back to Chile and immediately faced a lot of charges there. He came within an inch of going to trial. But then the Chilean judges at that time took the same position. And if they hadn't, things could have been very interesting.
Now, didn't they, I kind of recall that they discovered tons of gold that he had acquired somewhere in Europe just recently, right?
Well, what they found, a U.S. Senate investigative team, not looking for what they found of Pinochet's, found he'd stored $27 million in the Riggs Bank in Washington. And after people had begun to peel away from their support of Pinochet, not quite a large number of Chileans did support him, then when this was discovered, that was the end of all support for him except a tiny group of hardcore supporters. Because he turned out, during his whole 17 years in power, he projected the image of probity, of self-sacrifice in the interest of the country, clean hands, except for the blood on him, of course. And then they discover he's a crook. And that was a pretty big surprise to a lot of people, because he always projected exactly the opposite image.
Right. He was motivated by theory and politics, and he was really came down to greed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that he died in 2006, escaping trial, although he'd been brought up on charges a number of other times after he returned from London in 1999. But as time went on, he did eventually probably become mentally incapable of helping in his own defense.
How did you get interested in the events in South America at that time period, 70s and 80s?
Well, actually, one time I was teaching in Chile in one of our UNLV study abroad programs, and I met a man who had been in exile 15 years in Canada. We became friends, and I became interested in exile. And we did a book together, this friend and I. And forced exile is a human rights violation. You'll find it right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It violates 2 of the points of the Universal Declaration. And so that led me to go more deeply into the state terrorist regimes. I had a book come out in 2007 called, straightforwardly, State Terrorism in Latin America. And that focused on Chile and Argentina. And then, as I learned about these trials that were going on and the actual sentencing of hundreds of military and civilian collaborators, I decided to do this book as well, to do the background to how these trials came about. So I find it very interesting, but I'm moving on now. I've had enough of this topic.
And these trials are so different than in the United States, because oftentimes you have to prove your innocence to get out of prison. Correct?
That's right.
The burden is entirely different than it is in our country.
Well, the legal systems are very different.
Right.
I mean, these are based on really different assumptions and so forth. Although both countries, during the time I'm looking at in this book, had legal reform that made their systems a little closer to our system. And so they're I think a little more fair now. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that why it's been possible to put so many people away. Judicial reform in both countries made it easier to do that.
On a different topic, what's going on with Cuba right now? Is that good or bad in your opinion?
In my opinion, it's good. I mean, the embargo obviously hasn't worked. We've been through 9 or 10 presidents, while they've been through 2 brothers. And it hasn't worked. The purpose was to bring down Fidel Castro's regime, obviously a big failure. I think we'll do much better by having as normal relations as possible.
Yeah. You've been to Cuba?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Most recently in 2012.
Looking forward to going back?
Yeah, I'd go anytime. Yeah, it's a beautiful place to visit.
Yeah, lots of old Chevys.
Exactly.
Name of the book is Impunity, Human Rights and Democracy, Dr. Thomas Wright. And now we're going to talk about a different type of terrorism and murder that occurs right here in our country, in fact in Las Vegas. We'll be right back with Bill Friedman.
Time can change many things, but what doesn't change is our commitment to serve you.
So if you've been injured in an accident, or if you need help in your Social Security or workers' comp case, we can get you the best possible result.
Enough said. Call Ed. EdBernstein.com.
Well, as I promised, we're talking about now crime in the United States, in Las Vegas particularly. Bill Friedman is a gaming entrepreneur who's been in Las Vegas for quite a long time, has really documented the history of the mob in Las Vegas, has written a book, 30 Illegal Years to the Strip. And it kind of traces, 7 different families or mobsters over the years from Prohibition into casinos in Vegas?
Well, it's the 7 leaders of the 3 biggest Prohibition gangs. And these guys brought in an enormous amount of the world's most expensive liquor during Prohibition, and they partnered. Up until Prohibition, crime in the United States, organized crime, had always been little territorial things, They all partnered in underworld politics, overworld politics, and in businesses. And the group of the big three were gamblers. And they differ from other people in organized crime because all of them want your money, but the gamblers don't want to hurt you.
They want to keep the customer alive so they can keep getting more money, right?
Yeah,
Good business sense.
Well, they were really businessmen rather than, you know,
Right.
they were doing illegal businesses, but they weren't out there victimizing people. And they should have been the most unlikely people to survive in the underworld, and fate made them the most powerful gangsters in history. And they teamed up, on paper sounds ridiculous, with Chicago, which was one of the most violent groups. And after Prohibition, these four groups became the only groups to branch out across the entire United States, opened up wide open casinos just like today, but very high end. The finest restaurants and finest nightclubs fronted them, and then these leaders built the Las Vegas Strip. And in the 20 years from Flamingo in 1946 to Caesars in 1966, they built 80% of the hotels, and even though each one was owned by separate groups, they were one group of allies. And so there was a mob here that everybody worked together, everybody supported everybody, and they took me in a lot of years ago, and I've been working on putting together everything for this book.
And when you look at some of the movies and the television shows that reflect the times in those days, like for instance, The Untouchables. You know, I grew up watching Elliot Ness and The Untouchables, Al Capone, Frank Nitti, people who are prominently mentioned in your book. But it didn't seem to occur the same way that it's written in your book. I mean, if you watch The Untouchables, Elliot Ness, you know, was fighting crime every week and putting people in prison. That's not quite what happened, is it?
No, Elliot Ness was anything but untouchable. He spent his whole career in law enforcement and never achieved one conviction.
Huh.
And it's detailed in here. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, didn't want anything to do with him, and that's all brought out here. So what happens in Hollywood is the traditional historical movie. They take 16 headlines and the rest of it's fiction, including what actually happened in the headlines. We have got cases in the book where major mobsters were victims of crime, and every book has said they were the leaders of it, and they were the victims that brought down the actual criminals.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of some of these mobsters, you think of a name like Al Capone, you think like, oh, he was the man, but he wasn't really that grand at the time, was he?
He was, number one, primarily a brothel operator, and I lived in this culture. At that point in time, except for a pedophile, any man who took money from a woman was as low as you could be. He was as disrespected. They had to deal with him because he had the third largest gang in the country. But he was totally disrespected, and he was a beer man. And during Prohibition, beer sales went way down because to get a high from beer, think how much liquid had to be transported. The price went up. Wine was made illegal, yet the wineries of California sold 2 times the grapes to Italian families across the country. And there was gangs that did nothing but every day go around and pick up the cans of fermented juice every day. And then there was these 3 gangs that totally dominated by bringing in all the most expensive stuff.
Which was what? What was the high-end liquor at that time?
Well, Scotch was the #1 drink, but you had champagnes and all of these elegant drinks. The 2 biggest gangs in Prohibition were both in the Manhattan marketplace, and over half the wealth of America was in Manhattan. So the second biggest gang, I knew all of these guys, and they knew who was 1, 2, and 3, but they didn't know what they brought in. They kept no records. And But the federal government, in one court case, on the second biggest gang, proved that at a minimum they were bringing in 40 million bottles a year. Massive. All of these guys came out of poor economics, and around the age of 20 got the financing. Huge freighters would come to the international water line. They had financed enormous numbers, fleets of high-speed boats. They'd load up, they'd take off. Both the pirates and the Coast Guard would take off after them. When they got to shore, they'd load up these huge truck convoys, and the whole way they're looking out for hijackers in ambush.
And then they had, as you mentioned earlier, they had nightclubs where they can just distribute this. Copacabana in New York, one of the most famous nightclubs in the world, being one, correct?
Yes, and then after Prohibition and in '34 until they came here from '46 to '53, they opened wide open casinos, and what they do is have this incredible nightclub or restaurant in front of it, and behind it would be the gambling. Mo Dalitz had a casino near Cincinnati, and the showroom way back when this was a small country in the 1930s seated 1,600 people. Oh. The biggest stars in the world showed up, and when they finished, the doors opened to a casino.
Yeah. And of course everybody knew it was there and just looked the other way. When you watch a movie like The Godfather, and there's, there are fictional characters, but there's an implication that some of these characters are based on real life people, particularly Bugsy Siegel, Arnie Rothstein, people like that had an impact in Las Vegas. Is it accurate?
No, it's all nonsense. It's just fiction. Mm-hmm. Not one person prior to me had ever interviewed one of these people, interviewed one of their associates, and believe it or not, they wrote these books with doing no research. So everything in here, I say in my introduction, nothing you've ever heard about organized crime or the development of gambling have you ever heard before, because they didn't have it, and you haven't heard anything here because it did. This is all new information.
And there wasn't, were there these great wars between the families that television kind of implies?
There were a few of them. The guys, the four gangs we talked about got caught up in two wars. The first one, they were hiding out for a full year, and there was a lot of conflict for a year. And then there was a second war that followed it months later. But after that, they took charge, and they kept preaching to everybody. Now, not Chicago, but these three groups, and that included Siegel and Lansky and all these guys. They preached, why are we shooting each other? Why are we dying? There's enough for everybody, and they toned down the amount of killing dramatically.
These early gangsters in Las Vegas, the Siegels, the Dalitz, the Lansky, is there a relationship to them and the later guy, the Tony Spilatras and the Frank Colettas?
No, what happened was the three big gangs were the big builders. Chicago was here, but they were small players until the Stardust, which was the world's biggest hotel and biggest casino, and there they had a big interest, but it was all run by Mo Dalitz. He was the man, and they were silent in the background. They remained minor in the background until Atlantic City opened. And at that point, the people that were then in power here, they moved back there, and they turned the town over to Chicago, and they'd taken control of the Teamsters Union, and they financed Chicago buying all these places out as they were being sold, and Spilatro was brought street crime to the city for the first time that was organized. Up until then we had street criminals, but he was a new bad situation that had never been allowed to exist before.
Yeah. When you have researched all these characters, who do you find the most interesting?
Well, Siegel, I find the most interesting because the last 14 years of his life after Prohibition, he lived in Beverly Hills and Vegas, and I interviewed everybody that had worked for him, that was partied with him, that was close to him, and here he's supposed to be a nut because in his youth, the crazy word Bugsy comes along, They knew nothing about him, so they make this deal. Number one, everybody that knew him, including every banker in America, thought he was one of the best businessmen there were. At the age of 14, he built the biggest importing business there was at 14.
Wow.
I mean, awesome. When he was killed and it was announced that night over the loudspeaker, the employees stood around and cried for 20 minutes. And I don't think that happens too often in a big organization. I couldn't find one person, including his biggest enemy, that didn't like him.
He just had a lot
Exactly
of
the
charisma
opposite of everything. And was helpful. They were just so different than made out. I interviewed for two interviews, 2 hours each, a man he had a war with for war, not violent, but man was stealing from him. He knew he was stealing from him. Siegel wanted to catch him and put him in jail. I interviewed this guy, and the FBI, this was a tiny town, had one man stationed here for 6 months because they were convinced one of these two had to kill each other. And Siegel always preached against violence, and he used to get upset if someone would hurt someone for money. This man, when I asked him, were you ever afraid, he yelled and screamed at me, how can you be writing about a man who wouldn't hurt anybody over for money? Don't you know anything about him?
Okay. So he was really an enigma. The name of the book is 30 Illegal Years to the Strip. Bill Friedman has seen it all, been part of it peripherally in the gaming business for a lot of years. One last question. Mob still in Las Vegas?
Oh, no.
No? You heard it. Here's the authority. Thank you very much, Bill Friedman. This is a Bible of the mob. You know, check it out. See you next week. Accidents don't discriminate. They can happen anywhere to anybody. It really comes down to results.
Enough said. Call Ed.
I'm Ed Bernstein, and I've been getting those results for nearly 40 years.
EdBernstein.com.